Okay, so leather gloves have always been an interesting and difficult process for me. I never managed to find ones that would fit me right or that felt right on my hand. I've ordered custom gloves before and I've had to return them because no matter what I did, the fingers were always huge. I wanted to really see what it took to make a good pair of gloves, and online, the information didn't really seem to be there. It seemed like they would give you the marketing fluff. And as someone with a degree in marketing, I hate that. It drives me insane that all this information seems to be hidden from you. So let's talk about patterns. So patterns, templates basically, are the shape of the article of clothing that you're trying to make. Gloves, I really like the pattern of, because the pattern's actually really straight. This here is the pattern that I made for these gloves. You'll notice it's not very shapely, aside from the fact that we have the cutout at the back for the opening at the back of a driving glove and a cutout for the thumb. Everything's very square. It's nice. It's such a clever piece of design. And then you taper the back, sometimes with elastic, but in this instance with the closure. It bends over itself, creating shape. And the shape of a glove, realistically, comes from the thumb almost entirely. That's what makes the palm and back of the hand fit so well. But also the pieces in between the fingers. They're what provide the kind of taper, the natural shape of your fingers, and what make them feel comfortable to wear. Now, when you're talking about handmade gloves, they often have one of these, and they'll just trace it, cut it, they'll make the glove. But on quicker, more industrial processes, you'll have what are called knives. Knives are essentially the template. They're a pattern, but they're a pre-cut die that's kind of like a large cookie cutter, and they just use a machine to press it down, and then boom, you have your leather, it's in the right shape, and it's already cut. It's pretty genius. But when we're talking about custom gloves, they're not going through this whole process of making a template just for you, unless you're spending a lot of money. If you're communicating online with somebody, you're probably just drawing your hand, giving them a measurement of the width around your knuckles, and that's it. The problem is with knives, they make the template, but they don't offer you the adjustment. If you wanted to shorten the fingers, it seems so easy in your head to just be like, well, make the fingers shorter. But the amount of time it takes for someone to cut out a glove template with a pair of knives and to cut out the whole thing by hand, you're talking like a dozen times more effort to trace and cut the leather by hand. And of course, that's what I have to do. I don't have the option to use knives, but when you're talking about these large companies, that's what they do because they need to pump out a certain amount of product. So that's kind of the beauty of handmade and hand sewn details. They're nice, but they don't make the glove all that much better, which is why all these companies will choose to use knives instead, because it's cheaper, it's faster, and for the most part, it works for like 80 to 90% of people. It works for the majority. It's just that I'm outside of that, unfortunately. So I'm in love with this idea of vegetable tanned leather or raw leather. Basically, there's two ways that you can tan leather, and that is vegetable tanning or veg tanning or chrome tanning. There, of course, are other processes. There's even one that's kind of in the middle of the two, but just for simplicity's sake, let's talk about those two. Vegetable tanning is actually kind of using vegetables, or rather we could say it's using like tree bark. And you take the tannins from the tree bark and you apply it to the leather. And over time, a longer process than chrome tanning, it prevents the leather from rotting. Chrome tanning, on the other hand, doesn't use vegetables or tree bark. It's a chemical process, one that is faster, cheaper, and more efficient, and ends up lending itself actually really well to gloves because you get a softer leather out of it. Vegetable tan leather is a little bit stiffer, and that might have worked to my detriment in terms of making gloves. When you look for leather gloves, you're gonna find chrome tanned. But with chrome tanning, I don't like it because it's not good for the environment, and it's not as fun of a process. I like things that take a long time, but you get something better out of it in the long run. Now, this is kind of separate to the idea of raw leather, because raw leather is leather that has not been dyed. Now, vegetable tanned leather that's undyed is actually very open to new color, and that's the big appeal to me. The idea that you can take something and make it your own over time, that this piece is unique to you. This is the same thing we see with raw denim. Raw denim being dark unwashed denim that fades and contours to your body over time, that the wrinkles and the color that gets taken out of it is because of the way that you wear it. You get extra creases forming in like the crook of your arm or behind your knee if you're wearing raw denim like jeans. And I love that. And raw leather has found its same way into that workwear community. You have raw leather boots. They take on color as you wear them. You know, it's such a fascinating process to me. And I couldn't find gloves in that same way. So what I really wanted was a pair of raw leather gloves. And no matter where I looked, I didn't seem to be able to find them. They didn't seem to exist. And I also like the aesthetic of driving gloves. I wonder why that's the case. So, ill-fitting gloves and the desire to make something new, that was perfect for me. So I made raw leather vegetable tanned driving gloves. So if you're interested in following along, this is my process. To get started, we're going to need a pattern. What we're going to do is get a measurement around our hand, basically around the knuckles. And to do this, we're going to take some muslin, some scrap fabric of any kind realistically. I'm folding mine in half and wrapping it around my knuckles so that I can get a measurement of the proper width. Flexing the fingers and finding a measurement that seems comfortable and usable. I had to adjust mine a couple times to make sure I got the right fit, but at the end, it was all good. Then we're marking the spots between the fingers as close to the middle as we can get on the front and the back. And then we're putting that measurement down on paper. We want the half measurement here because we're going to be measuring just one side of the hand. Then we're making 2 vertical lines at the width of the hand. Now I'm lining up the front and back finger widths so that I can mark the finger widths properly between those 2 hand vertical lines. Then we're drawing vertical lines for each finger and marking the overall length of our fingertips. I ended up adding an extra ½ centimeter on top of each one and then make a line for your wrist. Once you've cut that out, you'll want to cut down the finger lengths as well. And because the knuckles don't sit as high as the webbing of the finger, we're taking the back of the hand down an additional centimeter. For the thumb, I just took a pair of gloves that I owned and traced out the thumb. I folded the paper in half and put the edge of the thumb on the fold so that I can get an accurate picture. And then we're good to go. We now have this little weird frog-shaped thing. I'm going to X out the bad one excessively and make sure that we're cutting out the right shape. So now we have our paper patterns. These ones are just for tests. So we have the hand, the thumb, cut out the back, and the thumb hole. And then we're going to need to make a test glove. Here I'm just using muslin, which is just some cheap cotton, but you can use anything that you have on hand. Just sketch your template onto the paper. I chose the thumb hole somewhat ambiguously, similar to where it was on the glove that I owned already. I just used pencil because chalk was kind of thick. And then we're just cutting out our test piece so that we can make our test glove. And here we go. This one ended up fitting a little bit tight, and the thumb and some of the fingers were a little bit short. I just opened up the top of the thumb so that I can get an idea. It was a little tight across the back as well, and whenever I moved my thumb forward, I noticed that it pulled the back more than I wanted it to. The back's still closed, so we know that we're close. I just added the tiniest amount extra to the thumb. Then once we have our finalized shapes, we're tracing them on cardboard. To get the shapes at the top of the fingers, I used some beautiful Canadian currency. For the pinky, I used a loonie, I used a penny for the ring finger, and I used a nickel for the middle finger. Not seen is the $2 coin, which is a toonie. And then we're rolling out our leather. Now again, I got a whole hide here, So what you want to do is get from the split side, the area that's not going to be either the shoulders, the butt, or right in the middle, which would be the back. You'll notice it's flexible, but probably not as soft as the gloves that we would see. What we actually need to do is stretch out the leather. Now, a lot of the videos that I saw, they didn't actually stretch out anything on the whole leather here, but because of how stiff it was, I figured I'll just stretch it out to begin with and cut up my pieces and stretch those again afterwards. I'm not tracing them just yet, I just want to get the rough shape that I'm going to need. And just stretch those out as much as you can. After stretching it, you can actually see the difference. It's a lot softer, it's more flexible, it's kind of more nice to the touch. It's still a little thick though. This is nothing like any of the gloves that I own and none of the ones that I've seen in stores. This unstretched piece here, it's so stiff. It holds itself up on its own. It's insane. The thing that got me though is that if you look at it from the side, there is some loose material. It's the suede basically, but there's this separation that I was convinced that I could cut through. I first tried it with a knife, but it didn't work. So I had to get this sharpening tool. I forget what it's actually called, it's not really important, I just borrowed it from my brother, but I had to do some practice to see if we can get it down right. It was hard to use. It was hard to get used to. This is something that I've never had to do before. It is nothing like peeling a vegetable. And that's why we practice, because I just thinned it way too much and took out part of the actual top of the leather. That's not what we want. But after lots of practice, I eventually got, I don't know if I'd say good, but we got better at it. After a lot of thinning, the back of the leather was still somewhat fuzzy. I could never really get it to the kind of smoothness that I would see on a professionally finished product. At the end of the day, I'm okay with that though, because some of the other areas that I ended up going too thin on ended up breaking or cracking later, and I'd rather have it a little bit thick than have it break on me right away. I know the leather will soften over time, so I'd rather have it start off a little thicker. And this extra dust here, this is very interesting actually. If you take all this leather dust and you combine it with glue, you've basically made bonded leather, the cheapest leather that is on the market. It's basically plastic and it's awful for the environment. It's not good stuff. And here's where I messed up. The blade was getting dull, and this piece of leather was particularly hard and stiff, and when I pulled on it, it just got stuck, ripped the leather right in half. So I wanted to take a look inside, so I took off the top so I could take a closer look at the blade. I wanted to see if I could swap it out for something else, but it looks like this blade is specially made. I tried putting in a straight razor blade, but it didn't work, so I brought out the whetstone. I also just love the way that this like bird coaster looks below the glass. It's beautiful. But so what I did is I took a cheap sharpening stone that I've had for a while and took the tiny blade and sharpened it front and back. And I did this for every single piece of leather. For the bigger pieces of leather, I would often sharpen it in the middle. It was insane and probably not what I would recommend. I probably should have just purchased replacement blades. So now I'm just tracing the cardboard templates onto the leather with a scratch awl. It's basically just like a sharp pointy thing. I'm sure you can use whatever you want. I've just happened to have one. And it actually just looked pretty clear. I was actually very surprised. Then we're just cutting it out. And now we have all of our finished pieces. These little finger pieces, fourchettes is what they're called online apparently, were actually very interesting. There's a little triangle or diamond in the middle, which is called a quirk. And I will get into this in a moment, but I did that wrong. The quirks were sideways, as we see here. So what I had to do is shorten the quirks because it was making the kind of webbing of the glove way too tall. And also that thread that we just saw, it was too thick. It ripped right through the leather. That's what I purchased because it was what was recommended for working with leather, but instead I purchased some very fine cotton thread designed to be worked with a machine, so that way I'm still using all natural materials, and then I waxed it with some beeswax. That way it can be durable and strong and last through the whole process of not only just making the gloves, but wearing them and putting through the daily strain. And then we're attaching the thumb we're kind of taking the top point of the slit on the thumb piece and matching it to that same point on the actual hand, and we'll see that notch kind of matches up in that top corner with the thumb folding over afterwards. So I ended up making these little thimbles. It was very simple. I dropped them on my finger, sewed them shut, and it was really nice. I wanted one on my thumb and middle finger so I could pass the thread kind of back and forth. Now when you're starting a stitch on leather, what I actually ended up doing was tying a knot between two holes. That way, if I just tied a knot on the thread, there's the possibility it could just be pulled through, but by tying a knot around two holes, it was much more secure. We just took that stitch all the way up the side, I put a glove on to try the fit, see how it is, and adjust as I went. When attaching the finger pieces, or the fourchettes, you want to line up the U shape with the back of the hand and the quirk, the diamond, with the front of the hand, or the palm. And then you just attach them along the side of the finger. So you start by using the inside of the fourchette. That way you sew down the side, the straight piece, and you end up sewing the quirk into the back of the hand. I had to make sure to be very careful when going over the corner because you want this piece to be secure. You don't want to overstitch it because you don't want too many holes. And that way when you move your fingers apart, you're not straining the cut in the leather so that it deepens. You want it to be secure and be able to move your fingers comfortably without it feeling like you're going to rip the glove. And then we sew the back of the hand. I tied a knot at the very center so that I could have two strings each going up the top of the finger. Now, where did I put my thimbles? Oh, cool, there they are. Take one, then the other, and we'll continue on our sewing adventure. Once we're done with the fingers, we're attaching the closure at the back. Now again, in my instance, I decided to use magnets because I thought that would be really cool. I thought that could be a kind of modern interpretation of a glove fastening. I ended up using the other magnet to secure the front one in place between another piece of leather and just sewed around it in a circle. Although I had those kind of sharp pieces, I ended up just cutting them into circles afterwards. And the magnets, they're so cool. Now, I wasn't able to put a trim around the opening of the glove and the hole at the back of the hand. I just wasn't able to get the leather that thin, but that's okay. Now that we have the finished gloves, I still have some trimming to do on some of the extra pieces, but they feel fantastic. There is nothing like a pair of gloves that you've made on your own. And the left one at least feels very soft. For the right glove, I ended up having to dip into some of the harder pieces of the leather so it doesn't feel as soft. There's a rip in the middle of the middle finger that I ended up having to reinforce with a diamond, but overall I'm very happy with them. Now in terms of the actual leather that you use, this was a huge learning process for me. For the most part, you're going to be looking at what type of animal did the leather come from. And the most popular one is hair sheep, or also known as cape skin. Now, hair sheep, I was expecting some sort of like beautiful, majestic sheep with long, straight flowing hair. I was sorely disappointed. It kind of looks like a regular sheep, but it's softer and more supple than your regular wool sheep. Now, this is one of the mistakes that I made. I knew I needed sheep leather, and I knew I was looking for cape skin or hair sheep. But when I was looking online, and I had to because we're in times of plague, I couldn't find any hair sheep. And maybe this is kind of the problem, is that there aren't a lot of people out there who are making products for people like me. People are trying to make their own gloves. It seems like leather crafting and leather in general lends itself better to making small accessories like wallets and keychains. I couldn't find any hair sheep, and as I was looking through, I kind of just forgot to look for it and just focused on looking for any sheepskin that I could find. I ended up purchasing an entire sheepskin, the entire hide, because it was actually cheaper. I could get an entire, hide, and I paid around 70 Canadian dollars for it. Or I could have gotten the split side and stomach, which is what the recommended areas were for making gloves, and those were like twice the price. It didn't make any sense to me, but that's where I went wrong, is I bought the whole hide, and it wasn't enough leather. I ended up having to dip into some of the stiffer areas, which would be like the shoulder or the butt, the back of the animal. Those areas are harder, and they're not as good for gloves as a result. The main problem with those areas is not only that they're stiff, but when you thin them out, as I had to do later, you don't really get the same feeling out of it. Leather doesn't become soft because it's thin. There's other properties to the animal that make it soft and make it supple. And that is definitely something I learned the hard way, because there are parts of these gloves that did not come from the split side, and I can feel the difference. I don't want to say bad. I'm very happy with the gloves, but it's not the same. The other problem was all of these guides online, they don't tell you the thinness of the leather. I knew I had to get something thin, but I didn't really have any sort of perspective for it. I was like, okay, I'll just get some sheepskin and I'll get the thinnest that I can find. But the thinnest wasn't good enough. I needed something in the realm of like 1 to 2 millimeter in thickness, and what I got was closer to 2 to 3. But that was the thinnest I could find. Even the split stomach sold on its own didn't go down to that level. And because I don't have any industrial equipment, I had to thin it by hand. All the rips and tears that I made by mistake are because I was either thinning an area too much, or thinned it by accident too much, or that it was a harder part of the leather, somewhere from like the back of the shoulders. What I should have done is either purchase 2 whole hides and taken from the sides, or just purchase only split sides. Especially if I don't plan on doing anything else with the leather, I don't want to buy more than I need. For the most part though, when you're looking at a pair of gloves in a store, you want something that fits you well, feels nice, it's soft, doesn't feel papery, and it doesn't feel like it's going to rip. Hand-sewn details are a nice bonus, but they're not a necessity. But machine is quicker and faster, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can get a great pair of machine-made gloves. I just wanted to do them by hand. So here are the finished gloves. I'm actually very happy with how these turned out. It wasn't a perfect process by any means. There's so much that I learned. There's so much that I can continue to learn as well. But for the most part, I've never had a pair of gloves fit this way. And of course, it was fun because magnets. They're so cool. I love the magnets. I've worn these a couple times too, actually. It's spring right now, so it's not exactly glove season, but I wore them while driving. They're driving gloves after all. Why not? And you know what? They're so cool. I like them, of course, as is, but as I kind of mentioned earlier, the main thing I'm looking forward to is seeing how these age. Seeing what changes over time, I think, is such a cool process. And to me, I finished making the gloves, but the journey these are going to take has just started. Especially when it gets colder and I actually, need to wear gloves. If I was to try another pair of gloves in the future, I would probably focus the most on getting the thinness right. That is something I'll need to purchase a special machine for, or see if I can find someone who sells vegetable tanned leather at the thinness that I need. But at the moment, everything that I could find online that ships reasonably well to Canada, they just don't have it. All the thin leathers that I could find that are categorized as really soft are chrome tanned or from different animals than I was looking for. But you know what? That's okay. It was a learning process. Anyways, I hope you find this as interesting and informative as I did, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.